Thank you. Good evening. This is really an honor to be part of this event, and it's just quite an honor to be in the midst of people whose works are reference points for me. I just couldn't tell you what it felt to be. So I want to start out by maybe just showing a short clip to talk about Africa and to also talk about maybe the danger of dance and performance, and then use that to set up some of the stories I'll be talking about, some of the women who have actually carved out spaces for dance as a cultural practice and for performance as a form of engaging and imagining alternative realities to the histories of most Africans. This became such a big debate. I'd gone with a couple of friends to make a film about contemporary African cities. This is Bamako. And every community we went to, the issue was, what's wrong with the women? What's wrong with the young girls? What's wrong with the young boys too? But there's this sense of disconnect and alienation between the older generation, who used to be real hot radicals. They read all the books, they went all over the world. Now they're in Mali, they sit under a tree drinking tea and bitching about these young people and their culture. And I found the issue was the younger generation had opened up spaces within the moral universe they're familiar with. And those spaces have become dangerous. And they want to do everything possible to ban these practices. And the Sabarni was actually a mixture. It was really a gender issue, but it was also about sexuality. And it was also these young women who were insisting that the morality of the dominant culture will not dampen their own expressions of their desires and their fantasies. I just want to talk a little bit about African bodies as texts, as archives, and methods. Originally, I had the ambition to actually talk about 4 African women who use dance for all kinds of cultural, political, and community-based discourses. But it's too ambitious, so I cut it down to 3 women. And the first 2 women, really women who have pioneered the creation of communities within which they can produce their own cultural practices. So the first person is Were Likin, who is Cameroonian but who lives in Côte d'Ivoire. And the other person is called Oyenike Ekundaye, who's generally known as a textile artist, but who started her career as a choreographer and used to perform with another set of people in Osogbo in Nigeria. Now what's different between these 2 women is that they weren't just working with any kinds of performers or any groups of performers. They've consistently worked with multiple generations that grew up in the communes they created in their various cities. In the case of Were Likin, she has a place called Kiyimbok in Abidjan, which is really a commune where all kinds of people who are dropouts from societies, who are actually feeling they're excluded by their parents, etc. All these young people go to this commune where they learn visual and performing arts. And dance and choreography is at the core of what they do. So that because the principle in Kiyimbok, which I'll talk about shortly, was to draw attention to the place of rhythm and structure. And so what she stresses in her pedagogy is this sensitivity to the body and to see the body as an accented body and to also use the body to create new accents of subjectivity. So the dancers, first of all, have to understand what it is in their society that has accented their bodies to be subordinated. And then they begin to break it down to begin to look for something else where they can imagine a universe that's beyond their subordination. And in my work, I've referred to this kind of aesthetic as an aesthetic of fragmentation. And by that, I mean a situation where, because of the historical nature of most of Africa, most artists have perfected the impulse of firstly creating a space that must be fragmented. Right? So, because they want to underscore the instability of power. Because if they don't make the power, the discourse of power unstable, it will perpetuate the oppressions that these powers actually bring. And so some of these artists that I'm referring to are not in the mainstream, but they've created their own mainstream. They've created what I'll call their own publics and their own commons. And they've used performance not only for entertainment, but to create the communities who would actually encounter social reality differently. So they're more proactive citizens, and it is that kind of work that excites me and which I want to share with you. Now, when I was talking about how Africa is seen, is that in our continent, the body is marked by that very Atlantic modernity. And what I mean by that is that our bodies are accented by the Atlantic modernity, where the separations between us are determined, or were determined, from Europe, right? And the languages of our national cultures were mostly European, right? And our indigenous cultures were either frozen in time by the dominant cultures, which are mostly colonial or neo-colonial, right? So what we got is that we see a continent where so many systems sit uncomfortably on top of each other, and people define their identities through the overlaps and the seams of these bodies and systems that dominate them. So in the United States or the Americas, we'll talk about African diaspora, right? But actually the point is, you're talking about the diaspora, forceful diaspora of a diasporic people. Right? So, because by virtue of the context, movements, and so on, voluntary diasporic situations on the continent, when slavery happened, the people who were enslaved were more cosmopolitan than was thought. Right? So they're not just simple-minded people living on trees that were priced out to be brought to the Americas. But they were themselves cosmopolitan people who had migrated from different parts of the continent, had mixed and created other global systems that networked Africa to Asia, the Middle East, and elsewhere, even before the Europeans stepped their foot on the continent. So you can imagine the trauma of that person in the New World. That it's not simply a question, because when people talk about the Middle Passage, people talk about an erasure of that Africa. Hell no. Actually, this is where Edward Glissant, the Martinican scholar, will tell you that actually no. That what happens, the archives of Africa, they're in the New World, not even on the African continent. Because what happens, it actually sees Africa and its various histories and identities that predated the Atlantic. He calls them rhizomorphic, right? Like the ginger plant, right? You cut it off, you plant it somewhere, it comes up again, and so on. So he actually makes the point that the folks we see in the New World, who we claim their Africanness were wiped out and they came into the New World with nothing, actually came with a lot more than exists on the African continent itself. Yeah? And so what then happens is, what are the kinds of texts that they produce? What are the usefulness of those texts in the societies they are produced for? Becomes the question. And how historical or how historically beneficial are they to the people who are in the audience? And those answers to those questions means that we've got to begin to imagine an existing archive, right? From which we've narrated our past, from which we've actually borrowed and rewrite the past, so that the pastness of the past, it becomes the product of the present, rather than the present being taken hostage by the pastness of the past. Okay?